The wind moved softly across the empty runways of Clark Air Base. The war was ending, though the air still smelled of fuel, dust, and smoke. In the distance, the low hum of an idling truck echoed through the tropical heat. It was January 31st, 1945. The Philippines had been reclaimed, but the ghosts of Japan's air power still lingered among the wreckage. Major Frank T. McCoy stepped down from his jeep, notebook in hand, his boots crunching over scattered fragments of aluminum. He was an intelligence officer with the U.S. Army Air Forces, one of many sent to study what remained of the enemy's war machines. He was a man who measured victories not in battles, but in blueprints, a technical mind searching for meaning in metal and design. That morning, something caught his eye. Amidst the ruins of hangars and the twisted frames of burned-out aircraft, one machine stood untouched. It shimmered faintly in the midday sun, its long wings outstretched like those of a resting bird. The silver skin of its fuselage reflected the light in smooth, unbroken curves. On its tail, faded but distinct, was the red sun of the Imperial Japanese Navy. It was a Mitsubishi G4M bomber. The Americans called it the Betty. McCoy approached carefully, running his fingers across the thin aluminum of the fuselage. The aircraft looked alive, sleek, aerodynamic, graceful in its proportions. Yet there was something unsettling about it. He crouched under one wing, loosened an inspection panel, and looked inside. Where he expected to see the thick black rubber of self-sealing fuel tanks, he saw only bare metal, polished, fragile, almost paper-thin. No armor, no sealant. Just a thin shell separating thousands of liters of gasoline from the open air. He tapped the tank lightly with his knuckle. The sound rang like a bell. McCoy frowned, then scribbled a note in his book. Around him, his men gathered, peering into the open structure, photographing every angle, every marking. The discovery would later pass through the Technical Air Intelligence Unit, catalogued as one of the most revealing finds of the Pacific Campaign. But for McCoy, the meaning was immediate. This was not just an aircraft. It was a philosophy made metal, a creation of obsession, of sacrifice in the name of reach. That fragile, beautiful bomber had been designed with purpose far beyond protection. And its story began years earlier, in a world not yet at war. In the late 1930s, in the city of Nagoya, a young engineer named Kiro Honjo worked long hours beneath the buzzing lights of Mitsubishi's Naval Aircraft Division. Japan's military had given him a task that bordered on the impossible: build a bomber that could cross an ocean, strike and return, faster and farther than any other machine in the world. To do that, Honjo would have to defy everything engineers of his time believed. The Imperial Navy's specification was uncompromising. A twin-engine bomber with a 3,000-kilometer range, capable of carrying a full payload while outpacing any fighter that might intercept it. It needed to be light, long-legged, and perfectly balanced. But the only way to achieve such reach was to strip the aircraft of everything that kept men alive. Honjo and his team began removing the very concept of weight. Armor was the first to go. Self-sealing fuel tanks, redundant systems, even reinforcement beams, all discarded. The fuselage became a smooth cylinder, optimized for aerodynamics, not defense. The wings stretched wide to hold fuel, the skin stretched thin to save every gram. Honjo saw elegance where others saw risk. To him, this was the mathematics of victory. In his design notes, he wrote, "Weight is the enemy of distance. If we must choose between armor and range, we choose range. The sea is our battlefield, the fuel tank is our lifeline." It was not arrogance, but belief, a reflection of Japan's wartime ethos. Western engineers built machines to preserve the pilot. Japan built machines to complete the mission. Purpose was greater than survival. By the summer of 1939, the first prototype rolled out of the hangar at Kagamigahara Airfield. Painted silver, it gleamed like a blade under the sun. When the test pilot throttled up and lifted off the runway, the aircraft seemed to glide rather than climb. Observers on the ground watched as it banked gracefully, silent but for the whine of its twin Mitsubishi engines. When the pilot landed, he sent a single radio message back to the tower. "She flies like a swallow, light and true." Applause rippled through the hangars. The Navy officials were impressed, the design was approved, production began. In 1940, Japan's factories filled with the rhythm of construction. Metal hammered against metal, rivets clicked in steady beats. Workers, many barely out of school, toiled under banners that read, "To fly farther is to serve the emperor." They worked 14-hour days, sleeping beside their workbenches. They spoke little, but their hands shaped history. Every part of the bomber was engineered for distance. The wings were enormous, housing nearly half the aircraft's total weight in fuel. The fuselage was long, smooth, aerodynamic. The paint was applied thinly, saving precious kilograms. Each decision, every calculation, bought another few kilometers of range. The engineers knew what they had created. They also knew what it would cost. A single tracer round through the wing could ignite the entire aircraft. Pilots learned quickly that survival depended not on armor, but on invisibility. Their best defense was altitude and silence. Among themselves, they gave it a name: Shinen no Hikoki, the plane of the far reaches. By 1941, with war looming, the first Betty squadrons were formed. The Yokosuka and Kanoya air groups stood ready, their aircraft lined up in perfect rows along the runways of Formosa and Kyushu. The young pilots, many still in their early 20s, ran their hands along the smooth fuselages before each flight, tracing the red suns painted on the wings. They were told the bomber could reach the Philippines, Borneo, even Australia. They believed in its power, though they also feared its fragility. One pilot, Ensign Masao Sato, wrote in his diary, "They say our wings can reach anywhere in the Pacific. When I touch the metal, I think, perhaps that distance includes our lives." The days grew shorter. Diplomats spoke of peace even as the Navy prepared for war. In the hangars of Nagoya, the final bombers were completed. Lanterns glowed late into the night as mechanics inspected each rivet, each instrument. The aircraft were immaculate, long, gleaming, elegant machines, each one a distillation of national will. Then came December. From the airfields of Formosa, in the early hours of December 8, 1941, a formation of 82 G-4M bombers took to the sky. The Pacific below was calm, a field of blue stretching endlessly to the horizon. Their engines hummed in harmony, a sound that blended power and grace. They were bound for the Philippines, their target, Clark Field. For the pilots, the mission was clear: cripple the American Air Force before it could strike back. They flew in tight formation, sunlight glinting off their wings, the sea beneath them glowing gold with the rising sun. From the ground, American soldiers looked up, shading their eyes. The planes were distant, glimmering specks that grew larger, their sound swelling in the humid air. Some thought they were friendly. Others ran for cover. At 12:35 in the afternoon, bomb bay doors opened. A heartbeat later, the sky fell. Explosions rippled across the airfield, hangars bursting into flame, fuel stores erupting into pillars of smoke. Bomb fragments tore through the parked B-17 and P-40s like paper. The air was filled with dust, debris, and the screams of engines dying mid-ground. Within minutes, Clark Field was unrecognizable. 12 of 17 flying fortresses lay destroyed. Almost every fighter was gone. The control tower burned, its windows melted by the heat. Above the chaos, the Bettys turned gracefully, their silhouettes momentarily framed by fire. They had done their work. Not a single one had been shot down. From the ground, the Americans watched the bombers fade into the clouds, serene, almost ghost-like. They left behind silence and disbelief. The Pacific War had begun, and Japan's new weapon had delivered its first message. In Tokyo, news of the strike arrived hours after Pearl Harbor. Naval officers studied reports of range, accuracy, and return speed. They smiled. The aircraft had performed flawlessly. It had flown farther, hit harder, and returned with fuel to spare. The impossible was now possible. The Mitsubishi G-4M had proven that the empire could project its will across the Pacific. It was the embodiment of Japan's aerial philosophy: distance as power, precision as faith. And yet, within that triumph lay the seeds of its downfall. Years later, when Major McCoy ran his hand along that same polished wing at Clark Field, he saw both brilliance and blindness in its design, the perfection of its aerodynamics, the fragility of its heart. He understood, as few did then, that this machine was more than an artifact of war. It was a portrait of the people who built it, their ingenuity, their pride, and their fatal devotion to an idea that mistook beauty for invincibility. The Betty had carried Japan's ambitions across oceans. It had burned cities, sunk ships, and outpaced the early Allies. But it had also carried its crews into fire, unable to shield them from the consequences of its own design. On that hot afternoon in 1945, as the engines of American transports droned overhead and the war wound to its close, McCoy closed his notebook. He stood for a moment beside the silent aircraft, the sunlight glinting off its aluminum skin. The bomber seemed almost alive still, graceful, patient, waiting for a sky it would never see again. And in that moment, surrounded by wreckage, McCoy understood what the machine truly represented. Not the power of Japan's empire, but the fragility of its faith in perfection. He turned away. The wind moved through the palm trees. The airfield lay quiet once more, and the plane, the ghost of a vanished dream, remained behind him, gleaming faintly in the Philippine sun. The revelation at Clark Field was more than a curiosity. It was a mirror. In the polished skin of the abandoned bomber, McCoy saw not just Japanese engineering, but a kind of faith, a confidence in sacrifice as strategy. The aircraft was too perfect, too fragile, too deliberate. It was as though its designers had trusted not in metal, but in spirit. When McCoy's men opened the fuselage for deeper inspection, the truth revealed itself in aluminum and rivets. Everything was reduced to the minimum. No armor for the crew, no reinforced bulkheads, no redundancy in the systems. Even the control cables seemed lighter, thinner, as if designed for a plane that could never afford to come home damaged. To Western engineers, it bordered on madness, but to the Japanese, it was elegance. Reports from the Technical Air Intelligence Unit would later describe it as a pure expression of operational philosophy, a phrase that, at the time, few understood. It meant that the Japanese had not designed the Betty to survive combat. They had designed it to complete its mission, no matter the cost. That philosophy had roots years before the war began. In the late 1930s, as Japan looked across the Pacific and saw only distance, Mitsubishi's engineers were told to erase that distance. The bomber that would become the G4M was conceived not as a weapon of destruction, but as a bridge of empire. It was to fly farther, faster, and lighter than anything in existence. The men behind it, chief designer Kiro Honjo and his team, were brilliant, austere, and utterly devoted. They worked in a nation that worshipped purity of purpose. In their world, a clean line was not just efficient, it was moral. Every gram of weight removed was an act of discipline, every simplification a kind of virtue. The result was astonishing. A twin-engine bomber that could carry a full payload from Formosa to the Philippines without refueling. At its debut, even American intelligence doubted the figures. 1,000 miles of range on 2 engines. Impossible, unless you sacrificed protection, redundancy, and comfort. And so they did. The G4M was born as a paradox, the most efficient bomber in the world and the least survivable. Its first test of fire came in December 1941. As the ashes of Pearl Harbor still rose, squadrons of Bettys took flight from Formosa, their engines humming with the precision of a machine that had never been tested in real war. Below them lay the Philippines, the first step on Japan's path to empire. When they appeared over Clark Field, they came like an eclipse. Dozens of black silhouettes moving in perfect order, sunlight glinting off their long, narrow wings. American airmen stared upward in disbelief. There had been no warning, no alarm. The first bombs fell in rhythmic unison, each explosion folding into the next, like the beat of a drum. In less than an hour, the runways were burning, hangars collapsed. Of the B-17s that had once guarded the base, nearly all were gone. A few P-40 fighters tried to rise from the smoke, only to be cut down by Zero escorts diving from the clouds. Lieutenant James Harrington, who survived the attack, later wrote, "They came out of nowhere. We never heard them until the bombs were already falling. It was like watching a storm that only existed above you." That day, the world learned what the Betty could do. But what the Allies didn't yet know was how far it could go. The bombers had come from bases almost 460 miles away, flown their mission, and returned without a scratch. No Western aircraft of its size could have done the same. 3 days later, it would change history again. On December 10, 1941, as the British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse patrolled off Malaya, they believed themselves untouchable. Heavily armoured, bristling with guns, they were the pride of the Royal Navy. But from the sky came a new kind of threat. Dozens of Bettys and their sister craft, the G-3M Nels, approached in waves, carrying torpedoes built for shallow waters. From above the sea, they appeared almost serene, gliding into perfect alignment. Then, in the space of minutes, the calm broke. Torpedoes streaked toward the ships, white trails cutting through the surf. Witnesses on deck watched in disbelief as metal met metal. The ocean erupted. The Repulse tried to maneuver, her crew firing furiously, but the bombers were relentless. One torpedo after another struck home. By early afternoon, both warships were gone, sunk by aircraft alone. It was the end of the battleship age and the dawn of the bomber's reign. Across the world, the news traveled like thunder. Japan had achieved the impossible. In Tokyo, the victory was hailed as proof of divine favor. In London, it was unthinkable. For generations, the Royal Navy had ruled the seas. Now it had been humbled not by a fleet, but by machines of aluminum and air. Yet hidden beneath the triumph was the same flaw that McCoy would later uncover, the fatal arithmetic of weight and range. Those same bombers, so graceful in attack, were already being lost to engine fires, to tracer rounds that turned their thin wings into lanterns in the sky. As the war spread across the Pacific, the Betty became both a symbol of terror and a death sentence for its crews. It struck at Darwin, Australia. It raided the Aleutians. It haunted every Allied base from New Guinea to the Solomons. Soldiers learned to recognize its sound long before they saw it, the deep, unbroken hum of twin radials that meant death was on its way. By early 1942, the Betty seemed unstoppable. Its long range allowed Japan to dominate territories that the Allies could barely reach. But range, like faith, can only carry you so far. At first, the pilots believed in their invincibility. They were told their aircraft was faster than any American fighter, that its sleek design could outclimb and outmaneuver anything with guns. For a few months, it was true, but technology moves quickly in war, and by mid-1942, new predators filled the skies. The P-38 Lightning, with its twin booms and turbocharged engines, was built for speed and altitude. The F-4F Wildcat, slower but sturdier, could absorb damage the Betty could never survive. American gunners learned quickly, aim for the wings. One burst was enough. Over the jungles of New Guinea, the myth of the invincible bomber burned away. Literally, flames trailed across the canopy as formations of Bettys disintegrated under fire. They didn't spiral down or glide. They vanished, explosions that left nothing but falling ash. Allied pilots began calling them the Flying Lighter. Japanese crews, more grimly, called them Hamaki, the cigar. Still they flew, out of loyalty, out of duty, out of a belief that to serve was to sacrifice. The Empire demanded reach, and reach demanded fuel. To add armor was to reduce distance, and to reduce distance was to lose everything the aircraft had been designed for. So the designers did nothing. The crews kept dying. By the time of Guadalcanal, the Betty's reputation had shifted from fear to fatalism. It could no longer strike without resistance. American radar tracked them. Fighters intercepted them before their bombs fell. Missions that once symbolized control now resembled ritual. Crews flew into the same ambushes again and again, their planes igniting over the same waters. Yet even in failure, the bomber served its purpose. It forced the enemy to fight, to stretch its resources, to chase phantoms across thousands of miles of ocean. Then came April 1943, and with it, the most famous flight in the Betty's long and tragic career. At dawn on the 18th, two G-4M bombers lifted off from Rabaul, carrying Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, on an inspection tour. It was meant to be routine, but in Hawaii, American codebreakers had already decrypted the plan. 16 P-38 Lightnings were waiting. They flew low across the sea for more than 2 hours, rising only when radar contact confirmed their target. When Yamamoto's formation appeared, 2 bombers and 6 Zero escorts, the trap closed. Lieutenant Rex Barber dove from below, his guns tracing a line of fire into the lead Betty. Bullets tore through the fuselage, and in an instant the aircraft was engulfed. Witnesses on the ground later said it fell like a burning leaf. When recovery teams reached the crash site, they found Yamamoto still seated upright, his sword at his side, his hand resting on his lap. The man who had envisioned Japan's aerial empire had died in the very machine that symbolized it. For Japan, it was more than a loss. It was an omen. The weapon that had once carried victory now carried only ghosts. In the years that followed, engineers tried to correct the flaws. The G4M2 added stronger engines and heavier guns. The G4M3 finally received armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. But each improvement came at a cost: less range, less altitude, less purity. And by then, it no longer mattered. The empire was shrinking, the skies belonged to the Allies. Factories were bombed, materials scarce. The once polished production lines became grim workshops where untrained hands worked by candlelight. The airframes grew rougher, the engines less reliable. Even so, new bombers rolled out, testaments to a nation unwilling to stop believing. By 1944, the Betty's role had changed again. No longer a weapon of conquest, it became a weapon of sacrifice. When fuel ran short, when hope ran shorter, the same sleek frame was reborn for missions that had no return. Some were loaded with explosives and sent directly into enemy fleets. Others carried the Yokosuka Oka, a rocket-powered manned bomb slung beneath the belly of the plane. The Betty's task was to carry it within range, release it, and die trying. Mechanics stripped the bombers of guns to lighten them. Crews painted slogans on their fuselages, poems, prayers, farewells. On takeoff, ground staff stood in silence, bowing as the planes disappeared into the setting sun. Few ever returned. For many of the pilots, barely out of their teens, the Betty was both coffin and sanctuary. In its narrow cockpit, surrounded by the hum of engines and the scent of fuel, they found a kind of peace. They believed that to burn was to serve. Major Takao Shinozuka, one of the surviving instructors, would later say, "It was as if the plane and the men shared one destiny, to vanish together." When the end finally came, it was quiet. The skies that had once thundered with engines were still. On airfields across the Pacific, hundreds of Bettys sat abandoned, some intact, others reduced to twisted frames. There was no fuel left to fly them, no empire left to serve. American troops photographed them in rows, their surrender bands painted white, their propellers removed. The images became elegies, silent, gleaming machines waiting for the torch. In the months after the surrender, McCoy's men returned to examine the wrecks. What they found was both heartbreaking and awe-inspiring. Even in ruin, the craftsmanship remained exquisite. Rivets perfectly aligned, panels still smooth after years in the sun. The same precision that had once served an empire now rested in stillness. Across the Pacific, the Betty became a ghost. In jungles and lagoons, its remains settled into the earth, claimed by vines and coral. Fishermen in New Guinea still speak of seeing its silver outline beneath clear water, a reminder of another age. In museums today, a few survivors stand restored, one in Tokyo, another in Washington. Visitors look at them through glass and see a contradiction. Beauty built for destruction, fragility mistaken for faith. The story of the G4M Betty is not just the story of a machine, it is the story of a belief that reach could conquer distance, that devotion could defeat steel. For a moment, that belief set the world on fire. And when the fire burned out, what remained was not defeat, but reflection. In the soft wind over the Pacific, where coral grows over aluminum and memory fades into salt, the last Bettys rest in silence. Their wings, once stretched for conquest, now shelter fish and coral. They are relics not of war, but of endurance. And when the sun hits their metal just right, it still glows, like a ghost remembering flight. The years after the war did not erase the memory of the Betty, they transformed it. In occupied Japan, the wrecks were everywhere, gleaming ribs of metal half buried in mud, wings that caught the light in the ruins of airfields where children played among the bones of machines. To them, the aircraft were not symbols of defeat, but of mystery. They seemed too graceful to have belonged to war. For the engineers who survived, those years were an exercise in silence. The factories that had once echoed with the rhythm of rivet guns were now workshops for bicycles, farming tools, and tin toys. Many of the men who had built the G4M returned to civilian life as if waking from a dream. They carried with them not guilt exactly, but a deep bewilderment. How had something built so beautifully served something that ended in ruin? Kiro Honjo, the plane's chief designer, rarely spoke of his creation after 1945. In one of his few interviews decades later, he said only, "We believed in range, but not in return." It was an engineer's understatement and an epitaph. Honjo's later notebooks, now preserved in the archives of Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, reveal sketches of wings that seem more like brushstrokes than blueprints. There are notes about airflow, balance, and silence, concepts that verge on the poetic. One margin bears a single phrase in his careful hand: "Even a leaf can fly if the wind believes." The same wind that once carried bombers across the Pacific now moved through the empty hangars where birds nested in rafters. Yet amid the quiet, Japan's post-war aviation spirit was reborn. Under Allied supervision, restrictions on aircraft design were slowly lifted. Former wartime engineers turned their precision toward peace, building the first Japanese airliners, then components for Western jets. Some of the same hands that had built the G4M would go on to help create the first high-speed trains and early satellites. They understood efficiency in a way that no longer served conquest, but connection. It was as if the soul of the Betty, the pursuit of perfect balance, had outlived the war that gave it birth. Across the Pacific, the Allies were conducting their own reckoning. In American archives, the G4M became a case study in contrast. To engineers at Wright Field, it represented both the genius and the flaw of single-minded design. One post-war report concluded its perfection lay in its limits. It was a design that obeyed philosophy more than physics. In the Pacific Islands, the physical traces endured far longer than the politics. Decades later, divers exploring the lagoons of Truk and Rabaul found the aircraft almost intact beneath the sand. Engines still resting in their nacelles, glass still sealed around ghostly cockpits. Coral had grown through the fuselage, softening the lines, reclaiming the metal. Underwater lights revealed control panels encrusted with shells, dials frozen in place. It was as though time itself had hesitated, unwilling to disturb the silence of these sleeping machines. In documentaries filmed in the 1970s and 80s, you can still see the faces of former Japanese pilots standing on those shores. They speak quietly, almost reverently, about the aircraft that carried them through the war. One man, Captain Hiroshi Tanaka, recalled, "When you climbed inside, it felt alive. You felt as though you were holding your breath inside something that was breathing." He paused then, his eyes on the horizon. But it was also fragile. You knew that one spark could take you and the plane together. We called it faith, but maybe it was just the absence of choice. That absence of choice became one of the great moral questions of Japan's wartime generation. They were taught that duty outweighed survival, that the machine's purity reflected their own. But when the war ended and the ideology that had fueled it dissolved, what remained was the machine itself, mute, precise, unrepentant. The Betty had been both a masterpiece and a warning. In the years that followed, museums around the world began to restore surviving examples. The process was painstaking. Every rivet, every strip of skin had to be recreated or recovered. Restorers in the Smithsonian found traces of kanji written inside the wings, names, dates, prayers. A few panels bore simple inscriptions: "For the Emperor." Others were more personal: "For my brother," "For my child," "For the wind." Those hidden messages turned the restorations into acts of remembrance. The aircraft, once instruments of power, became vessels of memory. Visitors often describe a strange quiet around them, as if the air itself remembers the hum of those twin engines, the vibration of distant thunder. Modern aviation historians now look at the G4M not just as a weapon, but as a work of art trapped in the wrong century. Its proportions anticipate the sleek airliners that would later cross the world in peace. Its designers, obsessed with elegance, unintentionally pointed toward a future where flight was no longer an act of aggression, but of connection. In that sense, the Betty became a paradoxical ancestor to both war and peace. Even today, in the remote islands of the Pacific, villagers tell stories of fire from the sky. In some places, they still refer to them as the long birds. At night, fishermen say you can hear the sea whisper through their hollow frames. When archaeologists recover pieces of them, an aileron here, a shattered propeller there, they treat them not as wreckage, but as relics. Each fragment tells a story of the ambition that built them, the courage that flew them, and the futility that consumed them. There is a strange beauty in that futility. It speaks of a human pattern repeated throughout history, to create something magnificent in pursuit of something tragic. In one sequence of film recovered from a Japanese cameraman in 1945, you can see a line of Bettys preparing for takeoff at dusk. The engines start one by one, light spilling from their exhaust stacks like breath in the cold. Ground crews wave, silhouettes against a fading sun. Then the planes begin to move, wheels lifting from the runway, wings catching the last golden light. It is perhaps the most haunting footage of the war. There is no sense of anger, no sound of battle, only motion, and then distance. In the narration for that footage, used decades later in a Japanese documentary, an elderly voice says simply, "They were beautiful, even when they were wrong." That sentence captures what historians still wrestle with today: the uneasy coexistence of beauty and destruction. The G4M embodied both perfectly. Back in the archives of Mitsubishi, preserved in humidity-controlled rooms, lie the original drafts of the bomber's engineering documents. The paper has yellowed, the ink softened, but the geometry is still exact. One drawing shows the entire airframe in profile, a long line curving into the promise of speed. In the corner, a small red stamp reads, "Approved, 1940. Looking at it now, one cannot help but feel that it belongs to another species of time. It is both artifact and warning, a reminder that precision without empathy can lead to tragedy disguised as progress. For modern Japan, the Betty's story is not one of shame, but of reflection. It marks the point where ambition met its limit. And in acknowledging that limit, the country found the humility to rebuild differently. The spirit that once built bombers would later build bridges, cameras, bullet trains, and satellites. The same obsession with efficiency was transformed into an engine for peace. In that transformation lies the true legacy of the Betty. It was a lesson written in smoke and steel, read slowly over decades of rebuilding. Today, when aviation students in Tokyo or Nagoya study the history of Japanese flight, they do not study the G4M for its victories. They study it for its vision and its flaw. They are taught that no design is truly perfect if it cannot protect the life inside it. That beauty without mercy is only half of art. And somewhere, perhaps, that would have made Kiro Honjo smile. Because in the end, his creation did fly farther than any of them imagined. Not across oceans of war, but across generations of thought. The wind that once lifted it now carries other dreams, of connection, of speed, of peace. And if you stand at one of those Pacific crash sites as the sun drops into the water and the air grows still, you can almost hear it. The faint, unending hum of twin engines that no longer exist, echoing in the distance like memory itself. A sound that says, once men built wings to conquer the world, and now they build them to understand it. In the 1980s, a team of marine archaeologists and Japanese veterans began a project unlike any before it, to locate and map every remaining G4M in the Pacific. They started in the Marianas, then moved to Truk Lagoon, Palau, New Guinea, and the Philippines. What they found was astonishing. Dozens of aircraft rested in silence, perfectly preserved by salt and sand. Some sat upright, their fuselages intact, as though waiting for pilots who would never return. One diver, an American named David Powers, described his first encounter vividly. You shine your light through the canopy, and there's the pilot's seat, the throttle still forward, the altimeter frozen at 0. It's like opening a door into another moment. For the veterans who accompanied him, these dives were pilgrimages. When they surfaced, they would speak quietly to each other in Japanese, sometimes leaving flowers or folded paper cranes to drift on the tide. It wasn't about guilt or pride. It was about remembrance. about speaking again to the ghosts that had been left behind. At one site in Rabaul, an elderly mechanic named Harada found the serial number of a bomber he had worked on as a teenager. When the divers confirmed it, he wept into the sea. "She was my first," he said, "and I thought she was gone forever." Those expeditions became the foundation for a new chapter in the story of the Betty, one not written in war, but in reconciliation. Japanese and Allied historians began working side by side, cataloguing wrecks, restoring artifacts, and recording interviews with survivors from both sides. The story they uncovered was richer than anyone had expected. There were American gunners who admitted a grudging admiration for the Betty's grace even as they shot it down. There were Japanese engineers who confessed they had known, even before the first flight, that their design would consume the lives of those who flew it. And there were islanders whose villages had been bombed, who now guided researchers to the wrecks with respect rather than resentment. History had softened into understanding. In 1992, one of the few surviving G4Ms was recovered from a swamp near Vunakanau and sent to the Kawaguchiko Museum in Japan. The restoration took 10 years. Every piece of corroded metal was cleaned by hand. Missing panels were rebuilt from the original blueprints that had been found, yellowed and frayed, in a Mitsubishi warehouse long believed empty. When the aircraft was finally unveiled, standing again on its own landing gear for the first time since the war, there was no fanfare, no military music. Instead, a single violinist played an arrangement of Haru no Umi, a Japanese New Year melody about the sea in spring. Veterans stood in silence, heads bowed. For them, it was not a resurrection, it was a homecoming. That restored bomber still stands today, a long, narrow body of polished aluminum, wings stretched like a bird at rest. Children visiting the museum run their hands along its cool surface, unaware that they are touching a machine once meant for war. The guides tell them it was built to fly far, and that it flew farther than any bomber before it. They leave out the rest. Perhaps that's as it should be. Across the ocean, in American museums, the Betty has found a similar piece. Curators display it alongside Allied aircraft, emphasizing not victory, but innovation. Panels explain the design philosophy: speed through simplicity, range through sacrifice. Visitors read those words and often fall silent. The idea of sacrifice for performance is not foreign to engineering. But in this context, it feels almost sacred and tragic. The scholars who study the G4M now write about it as a parable of extremes. In its pursuit of range, it gave up resilience. In its quest for purity, it found fragility. It represents the eternal tension in human invention, the drive to go farther, even when we know we might not return. That tension defines the modern world. Every aircraft, every rocket, every fragile thing that leaves the ground carries with it the ghost of the Betty, a reminder that ambition and humility must share the same sky. In the late 2000s, a Japanese film crew returned to the Solomon Islands to capture the wrecks in high definition. Among them was a young cinematographer named Ayaka Ishii. Her grandfather had been a navigator on a G4M that never returned from a mission over the Coral Sea. For her, the project was personal. She filmed the aircraft underwater, coral glowing blue through open bomb bays, sunlight fracturing across glass that had once looked down on flames. Her narration, soft and steady, closed the film with these words: "Every machine remembers the hands that made it. Every sea remembers the wings that touched it. The Bettys are not asleep, they are dreaming." That documentary, Dreaming Wings, won international acclaim, not because it glorified the past, but because it mourned it with grace. It brought the story of the G4M to a new generation that had never known war, and it reminded them that beauty can survive even its own destruction. In universities, students began studying the Betty not as an artifact of militarism, but as a symbol of the contradictions of creation. Some called it the aircraft of paradox. Others saw in it a metaphor for Japan itself: brilliant, disciplined, wounded, and reborn. And so the legacy continued to evolve, not through war stories, but through art, memory, and reflection. If you travel to Nagoya today, where Mitsubishi once assembled the G4Ms, you can still see fragments of the old factory floor embedded in the concrete foundations of new buildings. On clear mornings, sunlight reflects off them like water. Workers pass by without noticing, but sometimes, in the quiet of early dawn, an old man might stop, place his hand on the wall, and remember the rhythm of engines echoing from long ago. The air smells different now. No oil, no fuel, just the distant hum of commuter trains. Yet the ghosts of the past are not gone. They have simply learned to whisper. Engineers in Japan's aerospace industry, those designing passenger jets, satellites, and lunar landers, still invoke the spirit of the old aircraft. They speak of lightness with strength, simplicity with precision. They have taken what was once bound to war and transformed it into a philosophy of peace. In that transformation lies the redemption of the Betty, because the story of the G4M is not only about what it did, it is about what it became after it could do no more. It became a teacher, a warning, a mirror, and for those who listen closely, it still speaks. It tells us that innovation divorced from compassion becomes peril, that mastery of form without care for what inhabits it leads only to ashes. But it also tells us that even from those ashes, something new can rise, something better. Standing before one of the surviving Bettys today, polished and silent, the reflections of visitors slide across its surface like clouds over water. In those reflections, one sees not soldiers or engineers, but humanity itself, always building, always reaching, always learning how to balance ambition with mercy. The engines will never turn again. The instruments will never move. But the idea that a machine could express both brilliance and humility has taken flight in every aircraft since. Perhaps that is what Honjo meant all along when he spoke of the wind believing in the leaf. For the leaf was never meant to defy gravity alone. It was meant to understand it, to ride it, to coexist with it. And so in the quiet halls of museums, in the clear waters of Pacific lagoons, and in the stories passed between generations, the Betty endures, not as a symbol of war, but as an elegy for all who dreamed of flight, and for all who learned what it costs. When the final frames of the documentary fade, the sound that remains is not the roar of engines, but the slow, rhythmic echo of waves against a forgotten shore. Somewhere out there, under the coral and the sand, a wing still glints when the light strikes just right. It is enough to remind us that even the most fragile of creations can outlast the noise of their own making. That the wind still remembers, and that the sky, in its vast and endless patience, forgives everything that tries to touch it.